Hey, Adam, do you want to mute until we get going? Okay, my clock says 2:30, so I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping as we wait for other attendees to join our chat room. In the words of Casey Moore, my friend, the session I was just in, he dubbed himself the virtual talk show host. So I am your talk show host for the expecting and reacting to the unexpected, dealing with traffic data and COVID-19 implications. My name is Eileen Collins, excuse me, and I work at Dewberry Engineers. Today, we have three speakers, two from STREETLIGHT, both Adam Young and Ted Reinhold. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail on bios because all of that is typed in the session information. And then my colleague, Jerry McCullough, is going to be talking about a specific project that we both worked on for FEMA during COVID-19. So without further ado, I'm going to turn everything over to Adam. Adam, I'm going to put myself on mute and you have the floor.
Thanks, Eileen. We appreciate you all having us today. My name is Adam Young. As Eileen said, I'm the territory manager for STREETLIGHT data for what we call the East Central region, which includes Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, and a few other states down south. I also have on the call or on the webinar today, and you'll hear from him a little later, is Ted Reinhold. He's a solutions engineer for our Northeast region, and that includes Pennsylvania, the Northeastern states, Ohio, and Indiana. So as Eileen said, as we're doing the presentation, you'll see in I guess in your Zoom that you will have a Q&A feature. So if you have any questions pertaining to the actual presentation or the content, go ahead and type it in that Q&A. We'll address it at the end since we're kind of short on time here. And if you have any questions about access or you lost sound, put that in the chat feature and the team at Penn State will take care of that. So let's dive in. So what we're going to cover today is taking a look at traffic data and COVID-19 implications, why traditional data collection is no longer the best option. We'll look at STREETLIGHT Data on Demand, which is our platform. Then Ted will take you through changing traffic patterns due to COVID. So he'll take you through some real life, real world examples of how traffic is changing due to the pandemic. And then he'll also look at some more use cases like traffic counts, volumes, turning movements, and other traffic studies you're able to do with STREETLIGHT Insight on your laptop. Now, since March, only one thing is really constant, and that's nothing is constant. Ted will show you later some of the travel trends during COVID and how they've been changing as states put in new restrictions. But I believe it's safe to say that traffic volumes today are not representative of normal conditions. So despite the changing patterns, your work must continue. So whether you're looking for turning movement counts, intersection studies, traffic studies, AADT, any other type of traffic analysis, I feel confident in saying big data can help. Now, some of the long-standing data collection methods come with some inherent challenges in today's climate. So, one, they're unsafe and infeasible, sticking people in the field right now. They can take too long to conduct. They could cost too much to scale. And implementation of these data collection methods rely on assumptions of regularity, which, as we mentioned before, we just don't have right now. Now, STREETLIGHT data provides our users with 100% safe alternatives, so no need for having people in the field installing sensors or doing manual counts. It's going to give you instant access to your metrics in the matter of a few clicks. Big data is cost effective, often allowing our users to get more data for a third of the cost. And our data is available in many different forms. You can look at monthly data dating back all the way to 2014 with current data as of last month. You can look at data by day part or hourly, even 15-minute intervals if you're looking at turning movement counts or need that really precise data. Our data allows our users to understand what a typical Tuesday, Thursday in September and October of 2019 would look like, which may be more representative normal than a current manual count or current Bluetooth count or whatever you may be using at this time. Now, Talking more about streetlight data on demand, Streetlight Insight has been developed to provide the transportation industry with access to data for virtually every road in the US and Canada in the matter of a few clicks from your desktop. So Insight is not a model, a report, or a static heat map. Ultimately, what it is on-demand access to mobility metrics that allows you to avoid the lengthy, labor-intensive, and in some cases, unsafe data collection methods of the past we just discussed. Currently, our clients are running just over 3,000 analysis every month in the platform. Now, before I hand it over to Ted and before he dives into stuff in a little more detail, let's talk a little bit more about who we are, what we do, how do we get our data, because that's very important when you're talking about getting started with big data. Well, Streetlight's a software company that leverages the power of big data, transportation industry knowledge, and advanced data science to provide transportation metrics on demand. Every month, we process over 100 billion anonymized location records from LBS data. So when I talk about LBS data is location-based service data from your smartphone. Think about when you check the weather and your phone asks, would you like to use your location? If you say yes, you have enabled location-based service data to be used on your phone. And when you do that, your phone is constantly pinging a satellite. So it doesn't really even rely on cell service. Even if your cell phone goes out of service or a place you don't have service, it's still pinging that satellite. So we're getting our location records from this LBS data and also from GPS navigation devices. This is where we're getting most of our commercial data in the connected trucks. So once these pings are coming in from the smartphones, from the LBS data, and from the GPS devices, they are then transformed into contextualized, normalized, aggregated multimodal trips through our proprietary data process engine, Route Science. So it's able to take these pings and know if it's pinging constantly from at one point from 6 p.m. to 8 a.m., that's more than likely a home location. And in the inverse, if it's constantly pinging in a location from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., that's more than likely a work location. So it's able to do that just by inferring where the pings are. So Streetlight Insight, which is our product, is going to let you analyze how vehicles, bicycles, and pedestrians move on virtually every road to and from every census blocks. Users can create OD metrics, analyze top routes to and from any location, calculate monthly or hourly traffic volumes, perform select link analysis. They're also able to understand attributes of the trips like trip speed, duration, length, circuity, and travel time. And our users are also able to understand traveler attributes like inferred trip purpose, as we just talked about with the work and the home location, and as well as demographics. So with that, that's kind of the overview of how we get our data and a summary of the types of metrics that you can get in Streetlight Insight. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Ted, and he's going to dive into some of these analysis types, along with some specific metrics around COVID-19 travel patterns.
Great, thanks, Adam, and good afternoon, everyone. So we're now in December, and we're hopefully nearing the beginning of the end of the COVID-19 pandemic. But like much of the year, it still continues to affect so many aspects of our daily lives. And the pandemic is certainly impacting the transportation landscape in ways never seen previously. So with this new normal, there exists an evolving set of transportation problems that agencies, decision makers, they need to account for as they need to plan ahead for an unknown and ever-changing future. So these problems place a premium on-demand data that's robust, spatially granular, and frequently updated. So metrics from big data can provide not only current insights pertaining to changing travel behavior during the pandemic, but also an opportunity to deliver metrics using historical data that are more representative of typical travel patterns at a time when observations in the field just are considerably atypical. Next slide. So I thought I'd start off with a fun, local, real-world example of how big data metrics can quantify and measure some of these impacts. For all of you Penn State fans attending today, this might be a pretty remarkable sight, even during a, sad to say, down football season. This is the scene from the season's football game between Penn State and Ohio State. Normally, a pretty electric atmosphere, but due to restrictions on group gatherings, the students and spectators are not allowed in the stadium. But using Streetlight metrics, we can actually analyze some of those inferred home locations that Adam had mentioned at kind of a grid level, looking both in 2018 and 2020. So on the left, you can see the home grids for attendees to the Penn State-Ohio State game in 2018, which, by the way, set an all-time attendance record over 110,000 spectators. Each of those grids represents that inferred neighborhood level home location of someone that's visiting during the game day. And you can see on the left there again, fans attending from all over Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, DC, and of course, Ohio. So now if we look at the next meeting of these two teams, which was October of this year, obviously under much different circumstances with fans not in attendance, you'll see that geographic footprint of the home grids really shrink considerably, basically just down to State College, maybe some media officials from the Philly metro area, and of course the opposing team from Columbus. So this is kind of a fun example to demonstrate the capabilities of big data, but we can also provide very relevant metrics to the transportation industry for planners, engineers, and modelers. So another question that many planners are currently trying to grapple with is what are the impacts of COVID-19 on micromobility patterns? How are they affecting active modes like bicycle and pedestrian usage? And for anyone that's waited in line for a bike this spring, you might agree that anecdotally there's seems to be a lot more people out in the trails and in parks, but how do you quantify these trends and activity patterns? Well, on our website, if you could just go back for a second. On our website, there's a great new ebook that highlights bicycle travel trends in 100 cities prior to COVID and then during those kind of ensuing months of the pandemic. So I'd certainly recommend checking that out. So now we can go ahead and see how pandemic has impacted foot traffic in the state capital. All right, so with the big data metrics, we're able to identify pedestrian activity at a pretty granular quarter-mile grid, in this case, in the Harrisburg metro area. You see the kind of extruded height of the grid is corresponding with the relative volume of pedestrian trip making for that area. So on a typical weekday, it's not surprising to see downtown Harrisburg and the capital area kind of light up as top generators of that foot traffic. Now you'll see on the right here, we have some of those same grids visualized in a plan view. And what we've done here is basically take the relative activity in the 2019 spring and summer months and compare it to the same period in 2020 to visualize those differences. So green means that pedestrian activity is increased in 2020 relative to 2019. Red is decreased, and then the beige is kind of where things are relatively steady between the 2 years. So during the pandemic, you can see a decreasing pedestrian activity kind of throughout downtown and near the Capitol complex, which is next to that icon number 1. Also decreases at some shopping malls, retail centers. But we do see some kind of increasing foot traffic in neighborhoods, city parks. You'll see that identified as a park there at icon number 3, south of downtown. And then perhaps maybe a bit more ominously, additional trips at the medical center, which is the icon just to the left of icon number 4 there, those little green dots. Next slide. And the metrics from StreetLight can also help, transportation practitioners quantify the impacts of the pandemic on commuting behaviors, whether that's resulting from work from home policies or just generally changing economic conditions. And as Adam had mentioned before, at that neighborhood level, we get the home locations as well as work locations for devices. And by quantifying kind of the distribution of these locations prior to and during the pandemic, you can gain a little more insight into which communities have a large share of residents that are working from home and which communities might have a larger proportion of frontline or essential workers, people that need to continue to commute to work every day. So let's take, for example, the city here I'm showing, Paoli, in the western Philadelphia suburbs, obviously served by SEPTA. If we click ahead, there we go. The graphic here on the left is showing the distribution of work grids in the pinkish hue of the residents that kind of depart during the AM peak period from Paoli. You can see that town boundaries kind of in yellow there underneath it. And the magnitude of the employment is kind of represented again by the height of the grid. So you can see in 2019, there's kind of a distribution of work locations all across the metro area, but with a real high peak and concentration in Center City, Philadelphia. But now let's take a look at 2020 and we see a very different picture. So we'll see that the work grids for those same residents are pretty much primarily distributed over the town. So that's suggesting kind of an overwhelming prevalence of work from home or stay at home behaviors. So with the Insight platform, again, you can kind of monitor these trends over time and really start to glean, the rate of return of employees to work as those restrictions ease up. So again, as I stated before, the pandemic has certainly accelerated this need for on-demand and timely data. Agencies need to analyze the impact of EMT for a number of reasons, some of which are like gas tax shortfalls, impacts on greenhouse gas emissions, or really just to understand what that magnitude and timing of the economic rebound will be when there is returning activity on the roadways. So in response to this, StreetLight released a VMT monitor, vehicle miles traveled, in the early weeks of the pandemic, and we subsequently kind of updated and hosted county level daily measures of VMT for the whole lower 48 states. And this is updated 3 times per week to kind of provide some of those real-time updates. So here's a sample of daily VMT in Allegheny County in the Pittsburgh metro area. The yellow area is showing total estimated VMT in the county between February and October. The dashed red line is kind of a 5-day moving average of VMT. So it's kind of interesting to track the trends kind of from normal conditions pre-COVID in February to the very precipitous drop following the governor's stay-at-home order, and then kind of the steady trend back towards pre-COVID normal VMT as those restrictions are relaxed and the county enters its green phase. And you can see some of the little intricacies, the little dips and valleys. One is in July after the Independence Day holiday, there's a closure of bars and restaurants, you see a dip. But then on Labor Day, for example, you kind of see that rise as people are traveling for the holiday. And feel free to check out this monitor. It's hosted at our website, streetlightdata.com, if you want to kind of explore this national map and see the latest trends for your county. Okay, so kind of thus far I've highlighted several examples of big data-derived metrics and kind of the impacts of the pandemic on mobility, which is obviously the forefront on the minds of agencies right now. But there are a lot of studies and shovel-ready projects that require input data that assume typical conditions, basically other than 2020, to proceed with their planning, design, and implementation. So I'm going to highlight and showcase a few traffic data metrics from this list, all available at our Insight platform. And hopefully this can help transportation professionals continue their work even when that work is taking place from their home office. So rather than setting up a field data collection effort using traditional methods, it's again, as Adam stated, possible to access metrics on demand simply by creating your customized geographic study area, or as I'm showing here, selecting from standard geographies and roadway segments in the platform. And when setting up the analysis, as Adam mentioned, you can customize the data range, time of day, day of week, as well as pulling in some of that contextual characteristics of trip making and demographic data. So traffic data, it could be summarized at an hourly, monthly, or annualized average daily traffic count level. Can be determined for nearly all roadways, everything from a local street to an arterial to a freeway, both for kind of urban and rural types. In this graphic, I'm showing 2019 ADT summarized from that same selected sample that I showed on the last slide in downtown Erie. Next slide. Historical origin destination data can be collected really just a matter of minutes within the Insight platform. These OD data could analyze regional travel patterns, getting down to the county or track level, or more granular, or even very specific traffic movements along a corridor. So in this example here, I'm visualizing ramp-to-ramp volumes of vehicle trips, basically traveling eastbound on Route 30 as it's merging with US 222, basically bypassing downtown Lancaster. The bar chart shows the volume of trips between Route 30 and those various exit ramps. And again, this is kind of sampled for a typical AM commute condition in 2019. So we can get even more granular to determine volumes of intersection turning movements. And historical turning movements collected in kind of a big data approach from weeks and months of data in 2019 might actually serve as a more representative input or proxy for your geometric design or your VISM model than the field collected counts, which may be collected over 48 hours in 2020 when those traffic patterns are much more atypical. In the new year, we're excited to announce that the Insight platform also supports those 15-minute increments for counts. So you can see an example of that in the chart there, showing those 15-minute volumes at the intersection of I-79 here in Bridgeville. So you can see also in blue, the peak AM and PM peak periods. Next slide. So, a lot of cities around the country are, temporarily closing their streets to non-local traffic to, provide safer neighborhoods for the residents and for the people to walk and bike. Pittsburgh is one of those cities, and one of those neighborhood slow streets that they've cordoned off is located North St. Clair Road. So using a segment analysis and insight, we can actually look at average travel speeds for vehicles using different segments of this corridor. And beyond average speed, we can also look at distributions of travel speeds, travel duration, and congestion, which is compared to free-flowing conditions. And these data can, of course, be valuable for before and after studies to determine whether those closures or maybe traffic calming measures are working, particularly as it might pertain to an agency goal of achieving Vision Zero. Next slide. So, construction and maintenance work, must continue even during a pandemic. And as an example, back in August, the Chestnut Street Bridge in Philadelphia over the Schuylkill River closed for some rehab work. STREETLIGHT has a feature, it's called Top Routes. Adam mentioned it before, which allows the user not only to look at origin destination flows, but to dive deeper and analyze routing decisions between an origin and destination pair. So in this example, I visualized all the paths of eastbound vehicle trips between Chestnut Street and Center City, kind of on a typical morning commute period during the bridge closure. So you can see in the visual there, the bandwidth and the color of the segment are going to correspond with the magnitude of traffic that are diverting using those routes. So again, this could be a powerful diagnostic tool to identify those diversions, maybe kind of align that with the maintenance of traffic and the control plan, and also to mitigate cut-through traffic within some of those local neighborhoods. So, to wrap things up here, I don't need to tell you that there's been quite a bit of uncertainty in 2020, and it's more important than ever for agencies to remain informed. We feel that by providing current, robust, and on-demand data, this is going to be critical in all the decision-making in response to these ever-changing travel behaviors. And for engineers and planners, historical metrics from big data might present an opportunity to save time and effort for some of that field data collection, and something that can help you focus your energy instead on planning, designing, implementing those transportation projects and improvements moving forward beyond 2020. So thanks again for the opportunity to present today. I'll be available with Adam at the conclusion of the session to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thanks, Ted. And with that, we are finished with our portion. So once again, if you have any questions, go ahead and type them in the Q&A. And if they pertain to our session, we will answer that and get you an answer as best we can. If not, we'll follow up with you. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to you, Eileen.
All right, thank you, Adam and Ted. Great presentation. I see we do have some questions coming in on the chat. I think what I'm going to do is we're going to move on to our next presentation, and then we'll handle all of our Q&A at the very end. So Jerry, why don't you start pulling up your video, and while you're doing that, I'll kind of give you a little background. So Jerry he heads up our Mid-Atlantic Traffic Engineering Department for Dewberry Engineers. And the only plug I want to say about Jerry is he is a Penn State grad. So Jerry, are you ready?
I am ready. I believe I need Adam to stop sharing his screen, and then I can share mine.
Go for it. There you go.
All right, I'm going on mute. Jerry, the floor is yours.
And should be able to see my screen at this point, hopefully. So the subject of my presentation this afternoon is how FEMA evaluated and monitored the resiliency of our nationwide transportation network for FEMA supply chain analysis. So with that, first, a little bit about myself. My name is Jerry Mercallo. I am with Dewberry, located in our Fairfax, Virginia headquarters. I've got 15 years of experience, and I manage our Mid-Atlantic Traffic Engineering Group. I'm a 2005 graduate from Penn State, and I was raised in Scranton, Pennsylvania. I've got experience in transportation analysis and design, and I've worked with FEMA for 5 previous analysis projects for disasters. The agenda for this afternoon: first, we'll talk about the challenge that was presented to us. where we fit into FEMA's work and what SCAN is. We'll talk about analysis and monitoring process that we went through, some notable findings, and then finally some lessons learned. So the challenge, it was early March 2020. Nationwide COVID-19 infections were nearing 2,000 and deaths were nearing 50. Now it seems like a small number compared to where we're at, but at the time it was significant. Closures were beginning to be implemented, and panic buying was emptying out the grocery stores. I can remember myself, it was March, I believe March 12th, went in the grocery store and all of the shelves were empty of everything. There was a lot of uncertainty. Regional quarantines were being put into place and threatened elsewhere, impacting transportation networks and restricting or possibly deterring the hauling of those critical commodities such as food, water, and PPE into and out of those hotspots. So the questions were from FEMA, what would be the impact of what are called these non-paramedical interventions, which are these closures and restrictions? What would be the impact on the transportation network? And also, was there risk of supply chain failure? And would the highway network be reliable for delivery of those critical commodities? So where we fit in was on March 13th, Friday the 13th, ironically, 2020, President Trump declared a national emergency, activating FEMA and SCAN. So FEMA's Logistics Management Directorate manages the project, and what SCAN is where we fit in, is a joint venture, a group of a partnership between subject matter experts, researchers, and analysts working for a number of group of companies, CNA, American Logistics Aid Network, MIT, and Dewberry, to provide assistance and expertise during disasters for the monitoring of the supply chain. So Dewberry fit in as a portion of this SCAN network. And where we fit in and where Eileen and our team are the highway and traffic assessment team. We're one piece of the puzzle. There's also ports and intermodal. A lot of the goods are delivered by ports, and it's not just highway and trucking. There's also a specific team that looked at food and fuel. Also an ecosystem team that looked like from a macro level on supply chain movements, and a project management team to help manage that project. So what is the process that we went through in order to do this? We performed traffic data collection and analysis, assessment and monitoring, and developed recommendations for regional and national emergency managers from March through June of 2020. We performed analysis and met with FEMA 7 days a week for the entire mission. So Eileen and I, every single day, didn't matter when it was, we had a team of 3 traffic engineers working full-time on it. And we focused on the status of the freight network carrying critical commodities, both regionally and nationally. So again, we were focused on trucks rather than passenger vehicles. We tracked volume trends and measured the health of the supply chain. We also assessed the status of highway support services, such as fuel and truck stops, which are critical in importance in order to keep the supply chain moving and get goods from their origin to their destination, ultimately on either grocery store shelves or distribution PPE and things like hospitals. So how did we gather and analyze this real-time data on a national scale? We gathered traffic data from over 20 transportation agencies. Some of them are shown with their logos there on the right-hand side of the screen. And to do this, we leverage existing relationships in many cases where we had them through our professional contacts, and also a lot of cases perform cold calls. This was kind of an unprecedented challenge and mission for FEMA, and we needed to have traffic in real-time live data on a national level. So a lot of the data that we gathered was direct data from automated count stations primarily. In some cases, we were granted direct access to the platforms that those DOTs or agencies use as if we were employees. We're very gracious to the owners, many of which provided us unprecedented access in an unprecedented situation, where we were able to look and extract data real time from continuous count stations on freeways. In some cases, we got daily and regular reports provided to us from agency staff, either on a daily basis or several times a week. We also got class breakdown data. And again, we were focused primarily on supply chain and trucks. So it was very important for us to have classified traffic data. We weren't just looking at trips from point A to point B with all vehicles. We really needed to know which classes were traveling and making each of the different trips and how those changed during COVID. In addition to the direct data, we used some open source data where we could, or either the direct data wasn't available, such as looking and monitoring and counting on CCTV camera feeds, and then looking for travel speeds and congestion using mobile-based and things like Google Maps, where we can see travel speeds. So once we acquired that data, what was the next step? The first, after the acquisition, was in vetting and excluding suspicious data. This data did not go through a quality control process on the front end from the agencies. We needed it immediately, so there wasn't the time to be able to go through those checks before it was delivered to us. So we had to make sure that if there was an error with account station or other suspicious data, that was excluded. We then compared and analyzed that data to pre-COVID conditions, identified trends or important items of note that we saw in the data, and then moved it to a graphical representation of data and ultimately put them on slideshows with finding and recommendations. These analysis products that we put together went to leaders at FEMA and at the national level. And they're very busy. There's a lot of things going on in an emergency, and transportation was just one little piece of it. So we needed to make sure that we provided analysis documents that can be easily and quickly digested by leaders. So they were very graphics heavy. So what we did over that time was we produced regional and national assessments in calling them freight, traffic and freight trucking assessments. 22 of them over the period of a couple months. Some of them were for the overall US network. So looking at the global national scale movement of goods, and others were focused on regions such as the New York, New Jersey, and Southeastern Pennsylvania region, Chicago, New Orleans, Pacific Northwest, and California, as you can see with those stars on the map. Of particular importance, what this slide in the map represents is where the thicker blue lines represent the higher volumes of freight on the national level. So you can see the east-west movement of freight through the Great Lakes region, specifically in the Midwest, Iowa, and Nebraska. That's Interstate 80. So we had a lot of focus on I-80, and I'll show some info on that in a few minutes. I-80, runs through Pennsylvania as well. And you can see also that Pennsylvania is critical to the supply of goods into the Northeast region and then the New York metro region. Also Interstate 81 was a major route for freight commodities that we studied. Now I'll tell you some of the notable findings that we found. Overall, not a large surprise, you've probably all seen it, but that the national highway system generally operated efficiently throughout the height of the COVID restrictions. It benefited from a drop in passenger car volume. So as volumes dropped, it was easier for truck traffic to travel on those networks. But it was impacted by checkpoints, some of which were implemented in several states, and by expanded construction lane closure hours. So sometimes agencies saw an opportunity with lower volumes to put in some closures of sometimes of lanes, sometimes of entire roadways, which had the unanticipated impact of restricting the flow of critical goods and supplies. Truck services generally remained accessible, which was great. Truck stops were open. Private operators largely remained open, so like the major truck stops such as Pilot and Flying J. And closed some in-person dining though. Sometimes there was closures of rest areas. One example of that was in Pennsylvania. We did see some issues with that from the supply chain side because it impacted truck operations. So if truck drivers didn't have a place to have a bathroom break or rest for their required time off per the federal mandates, it was harder for them if things like rest areas were closed. The reassurance of the continuity of the highway network in the private supply chain allowed FEMA to concentrate on other priorities, such as PPE distribution. So if we were able to provide them confidence that the highway network and the supply chain was in good shape, then they can focus their efforts on other places that were critically important. One of FEMA's other big missions was delivering PPE and helping with the distribution of that to the hospital networks and healthcare suppliers. So some of the other notable findings we saw, looking a little bit at the traffic data, is that we saw that the truck traffic remained generally stable as compared to passenger cars. So what you see in this graph in orange is the total traffic mix with all vehicles in Iowa. And you can see the drop that happened in April went from about 200,000 vehicles per day in this area down to about 125,000. But with the blue at the bottom, you can see that large truck traffic generally remained a lot more stable than the overall vehicle fleet, showing that there was strength in the supply chain in the movement of goods. Also, something else was that there was, between different regions, exhibited vastly different freight traffic trends. So this table shows some of the different states that we explored and analyzed. And you can see where, from a week-to-week basis, whether those volumes dropped, stayed generally the same, or increased. So some areas such as New York State had a drop early on, but then continually increased and rebounded their traffic volumes as we went into April and May. Other states such as Indiana had a drop and then kind of had a flat line in volumes where they didn't really increase or pick back up until well into later into May and towards June timeframe. So everything didn't behave the same on a national level, but we generally saw this heavy drop late March, beginning of April, and then things generally remained the same or increased as we progressed. Something else is that the metro areas had significant reductions in truck traffic compared to national level. This is a metropolitan area, one of the agencies in the Northeast, and the white line was the previous year, the blue line was the current week, and then the red line was the previous week. So volumes were, even for truck traffic, were off substantially. The little dip that you see on April 3rd and 4th is a Saturday and Sunday. So that's why that volume went down right there. We also saw that long haul truck traffic remained robust though. So rural long haul, I talked about Interstate 80. This is looking at some select interstates in Iowa. And what you can see from March through May, those volumes remained remarkably consistent with heavy truck traffic. The supply chain was working and moving, and heavy truck volume really never dropped off. We also see that when we look here in Nebraska, and this is Interstate 80 again there, where we actually saw this was kind of bucking the trend, but some of that truck traffic actually increased during the height of the pandemic. It wasn't a significant increase, but it was an increase. Other notable findings was that while rush hour congestion dissipated, or in some cases disappeared, as you can see with the graph on the left, or the map pre-COVID, and then in March 2020 for an afternoon rush hour in the New York metro area, this provided an opportunity for the delivery of freight. Normally, they're stuck in congestion like everybody else, but when that congestion disappeared, it allowed some of those critical freight trips to happen more quickly than they normally would. Another notable finding was that interstate checkpoints had a significant impact on the highway network and impacted the flow of freight. This is from Florida, an area that we continually monitored, where there were checkpoints on I-95 and I-10. I-95 at the northeast corner of the state, and I-10 at the panhandle on the west side of the state. What we saw was that even though it was intended for trucks to be able to bypass the checkpoints, they still got stuck in the congestion. They weren't, passenger cars blocked up both lanes, and there was significant delay for the flow of truck traffic. And it's questionable whether or not that was an effective public health measure to stop the spread of COVID. We stuck with the transportation analysis sides, but I think it it was questionable, whether the impact on the flow of freight goods was worth having those checkpoints. Now, the last thing I'll talk about is some of the lessons learned from the process we went through. First one was that the need for real-time data was critical. Week-old data was too old to FEMA. This was a great challenge. We're used to collecting data and then having it analyzed, processed, and then delivered to us sometimes a week later, sometimes 2 weeks later. At the right-hand side, you can see just a sample of reports. Each one was a separate day. Every day from some of our agencies, we got detailed volume reports. It necessitated a different approach to data collection. We needed to mine those live traffic recorders real time in order to gain the data that we needed. We also know that we need to establish and maintain relationships and data feeds with transportation agencies in what we call a normal or blue sky environment, so that if there is the next disaster or resurgence of something like COVID, we're going through a lot of a resurgence right now, that we're able to quickly get that data without delay. And also know that the data vetting process is critical in order to identify and exclude any information that might be suspect. Also, the class data was critical, including separating small trucks from large trucks. So there's an image here, George Washington Bridge, moving from New Jersey into New York City. What we saw was a significant drop in small truck traffic. So when you looked at overall trucks, you can say there might be an issue. The truck traffic is dropping. What we did see, though, is large trucks were consistently strong. What we attributed this to was a lot of the restaurants deliveries. Restaurants were closed for the most part, and they used smaller box trucks for deliveries or just normal deliveries of goods or services in the city. But the larger trucks that supply to distribution centers and grocery stores, where a lot of the food distribution was shifted to, were still remaining strong and robust. So it was very important that we were able to separate those classes to get a better understanding of what was happening. Another lesson learned was that those checkpoints can have a high impact on traffic, and trucks should be allowed to bypass. It's also important to communicate with truck drivers that they weren't subject to quarantine to make a trip, so that they weren't afraid to drive these critical supplies into an area. There's an example of some overhead DMS signs that were used effectively where checkpoints were implemented to let trucks know well in advance that they can bypass the operation. Some of our recommendations about these checkpoints were passed on to state and national leaders, including the executives at states. And we feel that our recommendations as traffic engineers were used in some of the decision-making to potentially not implement additional checkpoints in other states. We found that transportation engineering and analysis was critical to decision leaders at the highest levels of government, both at the state level and as well as the national level. Quality control was critical for everybody. Some of the information we had was distributed and made public. It showed up in the news. So even in the hyper-fast environment, quality control was of utmost importance. And we had a process in place that basically real-time independent quality checking. And we built a solid foundation for if there is a future similar disaster. Unfortunately, like I said, we have a resurgence of COVID right now. We believe that the supply chain now is better able to absorb that shock, having the lessons learned from earlier this year. But it builds a good solid foundation for a potential future. So that's the conclusion of my presentation, and I'll turn it back to Eileen at this time.
All right, thank you, Jerry. I'll start my video again here. We did have 3 questions come in, and I see that they were typed and answered, but I don't know if the entire group can see the questions. So I thought I would go ahead and read the questions, and maybe Ted and Adam, you can respond. I'm going to start from the bottom and work up. So I'm starting with question. Has StreetLight looked at national trends in pedestrian traffic with COVID-19, overall percent decreases in the central business districts and increases in the suburban areas? Ted or Adam?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, I think that would be a really nice next step to that ebook that we put together that covers kind of travel trends and patterns during the kind of COVID-19 pandemic. So we analyzed vehicle travel patterns and bicycle trip patterns, bicycle activity kind of by different MSAs and cities throughout the country. But I think that would be a logical next step, is to actually see how foot traffic has shifted over time. So we'll definitely keep that in mind for kind of our next white paper. Eileen, I think you're on mute there.
I am, thank you. Another question regarding Streetlight, the volume data. Based on the validity checks for the product, what is the differential percentage difference users should expect between the LBS and the GPS derived volume data with actual field data?
Yeah, so for something like a turning movement count, for example, an intersection, it could be a little difficult to gauge what that differential should be, because there isn't really good continuous ground truth data that's being collected in the field. Now, something like a traffic volume on a roadway segment, we've done a lot more validation because we have good continuous loop counter data from state DOTs and agencies. And you can look at our white paper to learn more about the targets that we set, but we looked basically at different DOTs, understood what their kind of tolerance for air thresholds were for each of the different kind of volume levels on roadways. And when we took that into account when we kind of built our machine learning model. But overall, for AADT, we certainly feel that our volumes are very representative of actual roadway volumes. Adam, was there anything else that maybe you wanted to add there?
No, I would just say that if there is something you wanted to explore validity, like Ted said, it is on a case-by-case basis. There's going to be certain areas that may present some challenges based on volume. Low volume roads, if you're in like a cul-de-sac or something like that, it could add some things that prevent some, us from being completely accurate with that. So once again, it's probably on a case-by-case basis. There's probably not a textbook answer for that question. So well done, Ted.
I will follow up on that a little bit. So when COVID was first starting to hit, I did have a project in District 8 that we had collected turning movement counts at an intersection down in Franklin County. And I had reached out to Streetlight just to see if they might be interested in looking at that specific intersection, since I had current data. And we ran like a little test because I wanted to see if I might be able to use Streetlight on some other projects that were coming up that I needed data, and I knew that counting was not really going to work because we were in the middle of the pandemic or leading into it. And surprisingly, the numbers were very close for my particular site. So that helped my confidence with using the big data. So I'll just share that with the group.
Thanks, Ali. And there's always, and Ted can talk more to it, but there are always different ways to, take counts that you may have nearby or in the near past that we can calibrate our data to make sure we're, getting the most accurate metrics from our platform.
All right. The other question was asked regarding the Chestnut Street Bridge closure, the slide that you had up in Philadelphia. And it has to do with, was it possible to determine bike and pedestrians and how they were detoured?
Yeah, so if you're talking about basically a top routes type visualization, like I'd shown there for pedestrians or for cyclists, we don't currently offer that in the Insight platform, although I'm aware, I think it's a product feature that may be implemented in the next few months or so. However, you can look at that using kind of a standard origin destination analysis where you kind of set up those gates on Chestnut Street and then on some of the parallel corridors over the river there, and running kind of a differential before and after analysis to see how those patterns have changed. So yes, it can be done.
Okay, and I have one other question that's actually in the chat area. And I'm thinking that we could probably open up this question to some of our attendees as well. So I'll read it, and then those that are interested in responding, you can respond in the chat. So the question is, with transportation engineering incorporating more and more processing of data, do you think it benefits younger engineers to pursue masters and other training that is geared towards data analysis or data representation programs like ArcGIS, rather than the traditional extending of our base civil engineering education? So I'm going to open up to our presenters first. And if you want to respond, just raise your hand so we don't talk on one another.
Maybe Eileen, I can start. I think maybe some people, if they got anything to share in the chat, they can as well. But I think that having the knowledge of it and being able to navigate and use the data analytics and data representation in a graphic format, things like ArcGIS, is extremely useful. Specifically what we did with FEMA, we at Dewberry have a large team of GIS professionals, and we work very closely with them hand in hand in order to help represent our data and also to help to increase the value of our assessments and our analytics as well. So for example, we were looking at highway transportation networks. We were able to overlay that with regions with high concentrations of food distribution warehouses, and to focus some of the analytics and the assessments on things like food distribution warehouses and show that in a graphical representation for easy consumption by our federal audience who is using it. So I'm not sure if the right answer is, and maybe others can weigh in on this, on whether us as transportation engineers need to have the strong working background in ArcGIS, or if we just need to work more closely and collaboratively with those GIS professionals and those data professionals. But I do see the strong correlation and the strong value of having being able to work both those skill sets.
Thank you. Ted or Adam?
Yeah, I'll chime in as well. Those are all great points, Jerry. And I'll agree. I think we're living in a more connected world than ever. Kind of Internet of Things, all these connected autonomous vehicles, different probe data. So I think as transportation professionals, we're being inundated with more data inputs and sources coming into our work. So I think it's always great to have, you need to know the basics, your highway capacity model, your 4-step travel demand model, traffic flow theory, all those things. So I think those are good basics. But if you do have an interest in, geographic information systems or other data science topics, I think those can blend well if you have that base knowledge, because as we're moving towards a society with more automation, more data, being able to have be able to work and analyze data or work in data science and develop models is going to be increasingly more relevant and more important.
And I'll give my thoughts on this as well. I don't know if necessarily one needs to pursue a master's, but as Jerry and Ted had already indicated, having those skill sets are very important. And I'd also like to just kind of make a plug that as transportation engineers, I've been doing this for a long time now. A lot of projects boil down to transportation and traffic, and at the public meetings, that's a lot of the questions that are coming from the public. So I would strongly encourage anyone that is in the engineering field as a student, or maybe if they're thinking about going back, is to continue to hone your communication skills, technical writing, public speaking, and then using those tools that we have available to help communicate your message. So that's kind of how I view the GIS. It was a wonderful tool to be able to represent what was happening, but it really took some engineers like Jerry and others on our team, and Adam and Ted, you were able to do this very well with a presentation to kind of communicate and explain what people were seeing on the screen. So that's all I have. Over. All right. I don't see any other questions coming up in the chat boxes, so I'm going to close our session. If you do have any questions, please email the TESC@psu.edu. And I believe all of the presentations are going to be shared. I think our group all shared the clearance to go ahead and share the presentation. So they will be available on the Penn State website later. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.